Everything you know about Disney's Pocahontas is wrong. Most people know Pocahontas isn't the most true-to-life movie ever produced. Look no further than The Talking Tree. In fact, there are so many contradictory accounts that the truth about Pocahontas' life is impossible to pin down. Most of the Western narrative is based on Captain John Smith's account. Smith was one of the first leaders of the initial Jamestown colony in 1607, but he wouldn't write his story down until 1624, when almost everyone else involved in it was dead. That's suspicious, and, as we'll see, meant he adopted a lot of creative freedom. This video takes 9 of the biggest myths of the corrupted Western narrative and puts them firmly in their place. Myth 1. Pocahontas' name. The few surviving accounts of Pocahontas' life vary hugely, but a few unquestionable facts stand out. First, Pocahontas wasn't her name. In reality, her name was Amanute, and she had a separate private name, Matoaka. Pocahontas means something like mischievous one, and she was either named after her mother, or, more likely, it was a childhood nickname. Speaking of childhood, a child is precisely what Pocahontas was in 1607, when John Smith says he first encountered her. By the end of 1607, Pocahontas was about 11 years old, still very much a child by both Algonquian and European standards. And, by all accounts, a very free-spirited child. By European definitions, she was a princess, the youngest and apparently favourite daughter of Chief Wahhan Seneca, or Powhatan. And yet, the society was matrilineal. If Powhatan had died, rule would have passed to his siblings or his sister's children, not his own. So Pocahontas wasn't heir to the throne in the European sense. Powhatan had multiple wives, each of whom would bear a child and then return to her childhood village to raise the young one. As such, Pocahontas would have had many half-siblings. Imagine the Thanksgiving dinners. That sounds like a slightly terrible joke, but actually one of the first Thanksgivings may well have taken place in these years, with Pocahontas literally sitting there joining in. Myth 2. John Smith was paraded around the villages. The real John Smith writes about how he was captured and paraded around the local tribes. By his account, he was mocked and stared at. A white man from an unknown land who was just looking to help and in return was humiliated. Of course, that probably wasn't true. In fact, he sent a letter a few months after returning from the New World, long before he wrote his book in 1624. In this letter, he describes a much more diplomatic trip, with him being invited to tour the villages and meet the people, an invitation he willingly accepted. That said, he may have been violently captured initially, before being released by the Powhatan priests. With this hard evidence to confute Smith's claim to have been paraded around and mocked, we rightly start questioning what else he might have made up, and how great it would be to subscribe to this channel. And, if John Smith was never captured or paraded around the native villages, how could Pocahontas have placed her head on his to save him? That leads us nicely onto myth 3, Pocahontas saving John Smith by placing her head on his. Well, she almost certainly didn't. Apparently, Smith expected to be executed, having his brain bashed in against a rock. Again, his narrative is full of holes. Thankfully, his head wasn't. If those events somehow did happen, they were part of a religious ceremony, representing Powhatan adopting John Smith, not an execution. Most people think John Smith just made the whole thing up. It's also possible that he was racked by guilt for what happened to Pocahontas later in life, so invented further evidence of her bravery. However, the truth about Pocahontas' life is much greater credit to her than Smith's fictional, self-serving stories. In reality, it seems that Powhatan invited Smith to his house to talk about who he was. Pocahontas probably wasn't even there at this stage, she was too young. Myth 4. Pocahontas mediated between the English and the natives. Again, remember, Pocahontas was barely a teenager. Neither nation considered her an adult, and she wouldn't have been anywhere near the battlefield, never mind directly in between two opposing forces like Disney shows. However, she did act as a go-between in real life. From late 1607, multiple sources record her coming to the fort as she brings supplies and messages between her father and Jamestown. She may have spent some time with John Smith here, teaching him the Algonquian language and learning a little English in exchange. And in spring 1608, she acted as a silent representative of Powhatan in a prisoner exchange. Although Rawhunt, a native negotiator, did all the talking, the captives were officially released to the young Pocahontas, a symbol of the relationship between Powhatan and Smith, whom Powhatan considered his son. Myth 5. Pocahontas warned John Smith he'd be ambushed. Like most of these myths, we can't definitively prove this didn't happen, but it seems quite implausible. By autumn 1608, tensions were high, and the First Anglo-Powhatan War broke out. Powhatan moved his capital to Orapax on the Chickahominy River, keeping a safe distance between him and the English ships. In early 1609, Smith went to meet Powhatan on a supply run and prisoner exchange. Here, Pocahontas told him they're about to be ambushed, warning him to flee. This detail is yet another likely fabrication. Like most of what Smith says, none of it makes sense. For instance, as we've already seen, despite the war between the Powhatan tribes and the English, ambushing and executing a leader of either side would have provoked even worse war, something neither tribe could possibly conceive as beneficial. And secondly, Pocahontas was only around 11 or 12 years of age. She wouldn't have been there. Myth 6. Pocahontas fell in love with John Smith. Now this aspect is Disney only. There were apparently running jokes and mockeries about Smith's relationship with the very young Pocahontas. Whether those accusations were based in fact or malicious slander, we'll never know. Regardless, Pocahontas was at most 13 when John Smith left to return to England in 1609 after he sustained a gunpowder injury. She would have been a year or two younger when they first met. She insisted on calling him father when they met later in life, a token of the relationship between him and her tribe. Although he may have had an elder-like affection for her, they certainly weren't a couple in love, desperately trying to navigate Romeo and Juliet-style worlds while singing Rewrite the Stars. The remaining English settlers told her and Powhatan that Smith died on the journey home. Like Pinocchio, they couldn't stop lying. Relations with the English broke down after Smith's departure. The following year, 1610, Pocahontas married a man named Kocoum and likely moved to live with the Patawarmic tribe on the edge of Powhatan's territory. This tribe is what the Potomac River is named after today. Myth 7. Kocoum died fighting the English. While the Disney movie portrays Pocahontas' admirer, who in real life was her husband, being killed as the tensions between the English and the Powhatan mounted, the truth was actually much worse. For 2 or 3 years, Pocahontas and Kocoum were, probably, happy. They may have had a son, but all that changed in 1613, when British Captain Samuel Argall discovered she was living nearby and unprotected. Long story short, he tricked Pocahontas onto one of his ships and then refused to let her leave, holding her captive and hoping to exchange her for some weapons and personnel. But that never happened. Eventually, she was moved from Jamestown to Henrico. There, she learnt Christianity, and her diplomatic mindset and potentially good treatment meant that she was baptized and took on the name Rebecca. She perfected the English language and customs and began to behave like an English lady. Her husband, Kocoum, was, probably, distraught. As soon as he learnt of her capture, the marriage would have been effectively dissolved. When it emerged that John Rolfe, a 28-year-old whom she'd met during her religious instruction, wanted to marry her, Pocahontas' father accepted. And that was the end of the short but possibly happy time that Pocahontas and Kocoum spent together. In April 1614, Pocahontas and John Rolfe married with the approval of the English governor, Thomas Dale, and Powhatan, her father. The marriage bore a son, Thomas, sometime between 1615 and 1617, but also brought about the Peace of Pocahontas, a lull in the conflict and tension between the English and the Powhatan. Pocahontas' singular objective seems to have remained the protection of her people. Myth 8. The British kept their word. The Jamestown settlement was one of Europe's earliest cautious steps into the northern part of the New World. It was, in truth, an utter disaster. Without trading with the Powhatan and learning their skills, the English settlement would have seen everyone die within a couple of years from starvation and disease, all traces of its existence fading away into the swamp on which it was inadvertently founded. The natives then kept them alive, and Pocahontas became a symbol of that. Per the honourable gentleman cultural stereotype of the English, you might expect relations to have improved and for the English to start working with the natives instead of against them, in thanks for all the assistance they received. Well, no. The English and all the imperialist powers in Europe at the time were in a race to extract as many riches from the New World as possible. They didn't care about who they hurt. And so the English did not sail away from Jamestown, leaving the Powhatan to the land they owned. No, they exploited it, pushing further and further inland and creating colonies at more and more locations along the James River. The advanced weaponry and machinery meant the natives had no chance. Negotiation was the only way they could survive, a strategy that seems to have been pioneered by Pocahontas and her relations with John Smith and John Rolfe. Myth 9. Pocahontas lived happily ever after. If only the story ended like Disney showed. Sadly, it didn't. Pocahontas' life ended quite tragically. The Virginia Company of London, which had sponsored the Jamestown settlement, decided to bring her back to England and parade her around the country to raise further capital for their business venture. She and around a dozen other natives with her were treated as nothing more than an exhibit. She, John, and their very young son, Thomas, would spend some time in England, but it would be several months before she heard from an old friend, John Smith. Although Smith talks about their friendship, it appears Pocahontas was so angry upon seeing him that she turned her face away and left the room. When she returned, She blamed him and his people for threatening everyone except herself, telling him, "Your people will lie much." That was their final interaction. In March 1617, Rolfe and Pocahontas started the return journey. They sailed down the Thames when Pocahontas was suddenly taken ill and had to be taken off the ship. Tragically, she died in Gravesend, aged only 21 and possibly younger. Most people suspect the cause of death was a form of pneumonia or dysentery, as a good number of people in the New World were also infected with a similar disease when the ships returned. Some of Pocahontas' relations, fellow Powhatans who had accompanied her on the journey to London, would always insist she'd been poisoned, her usefulness outlived. The truth has thus far been lost to time. John Rolfe returned to the New World and set up his tobacco empire, leaving his and Pocahontas' son, Thomas, in England. To add further cheeriness to the tale, he would never see him again. And that is the tragic tale of Pocahontas. Over the following decades, paintings of her would slowly but surely lighten her skin tone, portray her in more regal European postures, and eradicate any indication of her real-life appearance and heritage. In truth, Pocahontas was infinitely more than European propaganda. She was brave, self-sacrificial, and utterly unique. It's this incredible personality that, to its credit, the Disney adaptation captures remarkably well. Her death in England, while it may not have been directly caused by the British, would forever deteriorate relations between the English and the Powhatan. Pocahontas' father died in 1618, and the fighting and tension would continue for centuries to come. There's no escaping it. Pocahontas was the only possible anchor for peace between the new and the old world. Despite her premature death, that's the legacy she leaves behind, a brave woman who dedicated her life to protecting her people. In other words, just because the English wrote something down 400 years ago or told you something in a YouTube voiceover doesn't mean it's true. Bye!